Welcome back to our Peace Through Strength podcast, brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. I am your host, Joy Votrobek, and I will be talking with our senior fellow, Alan Dowd, today on his latest article titled Free World Allies Rising to Authoritarian Challenge. We'll be discussing NATO and Indo-Pacific allies and their military expansion, as well as limits and how they work together. Welcome back, Alan.
Good to be back, Joy. Always enjoyed chatting with you, and good to be here.
You as well. And again, excellent and very timely article.
Thanks.
And since you're writing, we've also had Finland join NATO.
Yeah.
We've had in the Indo-Pacific, China ramping up their threats against Taiwan. It appears to be a more imminent threat. And then there's the question of our European allies and France specifically, if they'll support us toward a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. But certainly your article addresses the authoritarian challenges, and they have increased military spending among NATO nations as well as the Indo-Pacific. Alan, your thoughts on Finland joining NATO and how that benefits NATO, and especially during the Ukraine-Russian crisis here?
Sure. Well, Finland and Sweden both applied for membership soon after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in last February of 2022. These are dramatic changes. I think we could devote multiple podcasts just to this, but this is just a dramatic change. There's strategic effect. There's a geopolitical ramifications. There's a historical ramifications. There are a number of tactical military implications. But let me just start with kind of the historic. I mean, I don't know if Americans appreciate how profound a change this is. In the case of Finland, it's been a neutral since 1948. In the case of Sweden, it's been a neutral since 1834. And what Putin did, and Putin is to blame for this, as the Finnish leader said to him very bluntly in a phone call last year. What Putin did was just overturn literally centuries of neutrality for one of these countries, and almost a century, 75 years for another. So that's the historic ramification. It's truly a historic moment for NATO. Strategically, Russia, Putin, one of his motives in invading Ukraine, he said, was to prevent the expansion of NATO. Ukraine was not going to join NATO anytime soon in February of 2022. It had been promised an open-ended NATO membership. And Putin said this was one of his goals, was to prevent the expansion of NATO. Well, he got the opposite. NATO adds two potent and serious militaries. 830 miles of territory now will be additional Russian territory will be bordered by a NATO member. It's basically the Baltic Sea becomes a NATO lake now. Totally, virtually surrounded by NATO countries. In a time of war, it would literally be able to easily choke the Russian Navy out and off. So those are some of the strategic ramifications. On tactical military implications, we're dealing with two serious militaries. Admiral Stavridis, who was the NATO commander, an American admiral, commander of NATO a few years back, said this. I always have said to people in Sweden and Finland, if you want to join NATO, tell us Wednesday, we'll have you in by Friday. They're that good. And literally, the Finnish accession to NATO's the quickest in history since after the first grouping of NATO nations created NATO, but since then it's the quickest accession. I think Sweden will be close behind once the Turkish issues are ironed out. Yes. But these countries, they've been working with NATO quite a bit over the last several years. Sweden has been arm in arm with a lot of NATO operations, places like Libya, Afghanistan, the Balkans. Finland has played a role in some of these places. And then specific to Finland, Joy, NATO says we'd like every member to devote 2% at least of GDP to defense. Finland already does. Finland has a potent military. They have 280,000 personnel that can draw in a time of war, and then up to 900,000 more can be put into service. This is a serious military, and it is going to be a net contributor to NATO security. Some NATO members are really consumers of security. Finland and Sweden both are going to be contributors right from the get-go.
President Trump had addressed that during his time in office of NATO nations stepping up their defensive spending. So certainly this is a plus with NATO or Finland and Sweden. That's
right. Well, that's something going back to Secretary Rumsfeld, at least under Bush 43, every Secretary of Defense and some of the presidents they worked for were pretty blunt with some NATO nations needing to do more. And President Trump certainly pushed that very hard. But I think Vladimir Putin probably was the best catalyst of all of getting NATO to be serious again, as it was during the Cold War.
So like your article alludes to, he really brought this on himself, and now it's the opposite of what he wanted.
That's right. That's exactly right. And there's I think it's in the book of, I don't know, what part of the Bible, a scripture says, you sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind. I think it's Hosea, and that's what he did. And not only is his army being eviscerated by an inferior military, a smaller country, in every measure, it shouldn't have happened what happened, but he's really set his country back geostrategically to the point that I would submit, I think it's hard to argue it, Russia is more isolated than the Soviet Union ever was. The Soviet Union had a global community that it was a bloc, of socialist communist countries. It had the Warsaw Pact right in Europe. It had countries around the world that worked closely with it. Russia is headed toward the status of just being a large North Korea, and that's his fault. It's on his account that this happened.
Yes, and from my understanding, there's an article our senior analyst wrote on the Wagner Group, and my understanding is they're even looking at pulling out, or may have already pulled out of the Ukraine due to so many losses.
Oh, no doubt about it. The Wagner Group, which is a private military organization, years ago closely tied to Putin, its founder closely tied to Putin, and just has been devastated in Bakhmut, especially. Just like I kind of envision it's almost like grossly, shoving meat into a grinder, and that's just what's happening, or shoving a pencil into a pencil sharpener. It's just the Russian forces are being ground down, and the Wagner Group, which at one time was, sent fear into the hearts of the places it was deployed, which literally is all around the world, Africa, right, Syria, Georgia, and of course Ukraine, now has been devastated. And the leader of the Wagner Group is even talking about how Wagner needs to be reformed and needs to focus on different things. He's blaming the Russian government for preventing Wagner Group personnel from getting the intel and the material they need to fight. They've literally just had human wave attacks that have just been mowed down by the Ukrainians. And
I read an article on that, and if I could pronounce his name, I would, but I know he was talking of switching gears and probably heading back down toward Africa. Right.
And I'm not good at pronouncing
it's a hard one.
Russian names, that's right. But he's very disenchanted with the way the Russian government has treated him and the way he's fallen from where he was just before the Ukraine war.
And certainly NATO getting together and helping the Ukraine with this against Russia has been a big benefit to NATO and not so benefit to Putin. So
no,
I understand there is some possible talks coming up that if Putin's open to.
As I've said from the beginning, Joy, I think I've written it for ASCF columns. We should support you, whatever Ukraine defines as victory. What the Ukrainians define as victory, if they think they would be happy with the status quo ante-February 24, we should support that. If they want to liberate all of their territory, I think we should support that, though, because that the principle in international law that you should not be allowed to seize territory by force, and these kind of forced annexations or these fake plebiscites that Putin has had, that if that's not reinforced or backed up, it really could set a terrible precedent over the next several years. So if there's talks, that's fine, but they need to, whatever the Ukrainians want is what we should support. And I think the Biden administration has been good about saying that. Now, I do think the Biden administration could get more material to the Ukrainians more quickly, but by and large, they've been supportive of Ukraine, and every military commander throughout history has always said they need more. So obviously, President Zelensky, who's a military commander right now in the time of war, needs more, and he's always going to say that. But I think we've helped Ukraine survive. I think maybe now we need to pivot and help them win.
Yes, and we also have another front that we need to be concerned with. So that's my second point here is Taiwan, and as China's escalating that situation over there, Alan, do you believe, speaking of NATO, so yes, they are ramping up their military spending, and France has suggested or has said that they are not going to support the U.S. if we go to help Taiwan. Do you believe they're speaking for the entire EU when they suggest that the EU will not support the U.S. in aiding Taiwan in case of a Chinese invasion?
I don't. There's a couple reasons for that. I would say, first off, French leaders, since the European community and then the European Union was formed, to always have kind of an outsized view of themselves in relation to Europe. They don't speak for all of Europe on most matters. And I don't know if Macron said he was. I don't really remember seeing that exactly, but it's clear that all of Europe doesn't agree with that. Europe's a community of sovereign countries. They really don't have a defined common foreign and security policy, though some members of Europe would like that. But it's pretty clear in a couple places, in a couple examples, Joy, that the several European countries just don't agree. I mean, for example, or would do something more than what France is suggesting it would do, which is nothing in the event of a assault by Xi against Taiwan. We have, first off, we have European elected officials are traveling to Taiwan. Some of the more moving examples are the leader of the Czech Senate went there and spoke very passionately about Czech freedom being attached to the freedom of Taiwan. He paraphrased President Kennedy's "I'm a Berliner" speech, that I am a Taiwanese. Polish, Lithuanian, Slovakian officials have also spoken up in support of Taiwan's really just right to exist, right to be free. So it's clear to me that the Europeans aren't all behind Macron on what he's done there. And it sounds to me, from what I've read in some of the English-speaking papers, he's kind of stepped in it a bit. He's coming back from his trip a little bit on his heels, because he overextended himself and said some things that a lot of European leaders weren't very happy with, and a lot of American leaders aren't very happy with.
No, I can
also,
imagine.
kind of on the functional things, or on doing rather than just talking. If China moves against Taiwan, there's not a whole bunch, I would submit, that the Czech military is going to do, or the Lithuanian or the Polish military is going to do, but and probably not the French military, though the French have the most assets in the Indo-Pacific, literally military assets, and they have several thousand French nationals live in territories that are French in the Indo-Pacific, more so than other members of the European Union. but
and I
but there are
believe
members.
they also crossed the Taiwan Straits as well, right? Making a statement there, didn't they?
Pardon me?
Weren't they also part of moving across the Taiwan Straits there, making a statement basically to China?
Yeah, yeah, the Chinese doing that. That's right. There's but what I'm driving at is on hardcore actions that there are examples of whether it be the case of the Netherlands, they're working with the U.S. to stand up to China on semiconductor production. That they're working with the Japanese and the Americans to keep Chinese from getting certain important equipment that helps you develop semiconductors. So I think there's some unity there in Europe, or some support for the United States standing up to, and the Japanese standing up to China. I think it's possible that the French are saying something that they actually may not. When push comes to shove, they may not do what they're saying, but it is sending a bad signal, though, and a bad message for sure. And we're talking about deterrence and peace through strength. The worst thing to do with a dictator is to give him a temptation or give him a reason for doubt. Churchill always said, "Let us avoid temptations to a trial of strength." That's the way to peace. That's the way to keep the peace in a dangerous world. This just gives temptation. This kind of things that Macron done, which, by the way, are the kinds of things that French leaders did with Putin before Macron's time. And look at where that ended up in Ukraine.
Yes, exactly. And like you said, the NATO nations in Europe are not going to be as effective with the Chinese-Taiwan problem there. But our Indo-Pacific allies, certainly Japan, probably the Philippines, maybe South Korea there, would definitely, Australia.
Right. Well, the Japanese, they've said very clearly and very surprisingly over the last 12, 14, 18 months that they would support the United States if it needed assistance in defending Taiwan. And Japanese islands are very close to Taiwan. The Japanese understand that China being able to control Taiwan would allow it to radiate its power and project its power, really unfettered maritime power and air power, in a way that would really put at great risk the Japanese islands. So the Japanese are very serious about this. The Australians, the previous government said they would support the United States. This new government a little more cagey, but I can't imagine that Australia would bar, U.S. assets that are based there from being used. And but definitely the Japanese and the Philippines are serious about it.
Them being one of our Five Eyes and the intel sharing.
Right.
So
that's right.
Well, my last question for you, Alan, in your article, and I thought this was interesting because I was not aware of this, but you discussed Japan and South Korea and their participation in NATO's Cyber Defense Center. Could you expand on that?
Right. Sure. It is a kind of eye-opening and surprising to a lot of folks that Japan and South Korea and others are participants, what they're called member nations, are contributing members to the NATO Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, I think is what it's called. It's a very long title, but NATO stood this organization up, Joy, after Estonia was massively attacked in what some people call Web War One or Cyber War One. Russia did this in 2008, and NATO, in the wake of that, stood up a cyber security and preparedness center. So NATO nations, and then they invite other nations to participate. And Japan and South Korea, both of whom have been victims of Chinese and North Korean cyber assaults, are partners. The organization conducts exercises, cyber wargaming. It shares best practices, shares technologies. It coordinates strategy. It helps build up. The key in the cyberspace is what's called resiliency, and it helps build up resiliency. And so if you're sphere of cyberspace is attacked, you can lean on some other partner to help you kind of reconstitute that cyber that area of cyberspace that's been hit. So it's an important organization. These two democracies aren't the only non-NATO members. Australia, Austria, Ireland, Switzerland, and Ukraine are all part of this NATO Cyber Defense Center. All of them democracies, and all of them contributing something and also getting something from the efforts. We did know, just since you and I have talked quite a bit about Ukraine, and we started with that, it was, let it be known, it wasn't leaked, it was known last spring, summer, that U.S. Cyber elements helped Ukraine in several ways early in the war. I would submit that's probably continuing, and I'm sure other members of NATO are as well. As cyberspace is key to functioning of government and services and just society in 2023, as we know nowadays. It's basically an essential
certainly
nowadays.
The future here.
Yeah, that's right. So, but yes, the Japanese and South Koreans are a part of that. I think their official term is contributing members or contributing participants in this fairly new organization, this kind of arm of NATO that's been around since sometime in 2009 after the attack Russia launched against Estonia in 2008.
Okay. Well, thank you for bringing that to our attention in your paper.
You're
here.
welcome.
And that's what also made me think that, or question why the EU would not support us in some sort of way. So even if it is cyber or intel, it's...
Sure. And there could be ways that, it's also possible that countries could support us and Taiwan in quiet, under the radar ways. But and then there's another big factor. I mean, if the worst happened in Taiwan and Xi attacked it, like Russia attacked Ukraine, there would be a huge number of financial and economic ramifications that EU countries and maybe the EU itself, I think, would be asked to participate in, as they have with Russia. And those would be costly on both sides because China is so much more integrated than Russia, really, and so much more important in the financial space than Russia when it comes to trade, manufacturing, and other things. But
so certainly China has to weigh that option there as well.
That's right, and we hope that they are, and we hope that cooler heads prevail. But Xi does seem to act like he wants to what he calls unify China.
Yes,
I always remind people that Taiwan's never been part of the People's Republic of China. People's Republic of China was born in 1949. Taiwan has never been under the reign of the PRC. It has been part of China, but not part of the PRC. So when Xi uses the term reunification, I think he's purposely misusing that word to try to play a bit of sleight of hand.
Just like he tried to bring Hong Kong back under Chinese rule.
Right, that's right, and that's something, he did that, and many people thought that he would never succeed in doing that. He did it really without much difficulty, to be honest.
Right.
That was a violation of an international treaty that, Hong Kong was not supposed to. This was not supposed to happen. International China, Beijing signed a treaty saying that they would not do this, and yet they've absorbed Hong Kong, and now Hong Kong is under control of Beijing.
And I think that goes back to an important point you made earlier with us supporting the Ukraine in what they want to do going forward with Russia. Because if we continue to allow Russia just to annex what they want, then that probably persuades President Xi to think he can do the same.
Correct. And that's why it's important for Ukraine to win as it defines winning. That's why it was important that Ukraine stood up to Putin. Putin expected a 3-day war, and either the decapitation or the fleeing of the democratic Ukrainian government. It's why it was so important that we we, the United States, the British, and some allies got those anti-tank missiles and anti-air missiles in there rapidly the first week, and allowed Ukraine to fend off that first wave, and then start to take back its country. And I think the spring offensive will take back more of it. And I think every time that Ukraine takes more of its own territory, and to be very grim and grisly, every Russian body bag that heads back to Russian territory gives Xi a sense of pause.
Yes, and the spring offensive is what I was reading about when I was talking earlier of maybe Putin being open to some talks.
Yeah, I hope it's true. I hope it's genuine. He said that before, and some of the talks basically that they had way back were just basically the Russians saying, you have to drop your weapons, agree to Russian control of your government. It's not really much of a talk, if you're just saying we're stating unreasonable demands. And so then that, by the way, encourages Ukraine to be just as hard and dig in just as hard for its demands, which are understandable. As I remind people, I speak with, and I know I don't need to remind you, but, if Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ceases to exist. If Russia stops fighting, the war ends. So it's these people who talk about we need to have talks, we need to have land for peace. That's not reasonable. That's not just. Ukraine did not start this war. Right. Ukraine did not want this war. Ukraine did nothing to cause this war, which, by the way, began in 2014 when Putin and Wagner Group, by the way, going back full circle to your earlier point, Wagner Group soldiers, stripped of insignia, seized Crimea.
You took the words right out of my mouth, because I was thinking the same thing. This could have been prevented with doing something more about annexing Crimea.
That's right. Absolutely right. And our response, America's, NATO's, and by the way, NATO always follows America's cue, America's lead. So it started with our response, or lack thereof, was devastating to the Ukraine's cause, to a democratic Ukraine, to the free world's efforts, and it sent a terrible signal to people like Putin and Xi. Zelensky's predecessor came here to our Congress and said, "We appreciate the aid you've given us." This is in 2015. But one cannot win a war with blankets and MREs, because that's all we were sending, under the Obama administration. Right. Instead of sending anti-tank missiles and anti-aircraft missiles and things that could really make Putin hurt and make his army bleed, we didn't want to offend the man who caused a war, which makes no sense to me. And then we end up with 2022, a full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Yep. Yes, so we need to mean it and stop with this annexation that Russia continues to do without repercussions. I mean, we're finally getting repercussions here, but certainly want to stand by what the Ukraine is able to do to stop this.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, going back to what is our, guide star at ASCF, I firmly believe I poured over and studied as many of Reagan's foreign policy speeches as there is, and I firmly believe he would support Ukraine's self-defense. He would definitely see this as providing aid to freedom fighters, which he said, supporting freedom fighters is a matter of our self-interest, and because he understood freedom anywhere is connected to the freedom in America, and I think he would definitely support aiding Ukraine, and he might have done it a different way than Biden, but I think he'd support where we are and what we've been doing.
Yes, I think a support to democracies is a sign to the world too, and as we're seeing more, unfortunately, Latin American countries go red, Marxist leaning, we want to show that we support democracies, free democracies across the world.
Absolutely.
And I will end with a statement, or yes, I guess I will say a quote you have in your article at the end by President Kennedy, reminding the American people, "We put ourselves by our own will and by necessity into defensive alliances with countries all around the globe." as a peace through strength motto, that is certainly where we want to be. So I appreciate that, Alan. I appreciate that summary there, and your article as well.
Well, thank you, Joy. Yeah, that's a great reminder from President Kennedy, to those on the disengagement left and the disengagement right of America, that it was our decision, America's and Americans' decision, to build up this web of alliances around the world, this web of alliances of free countries around the world, because we understood it served our interests in 1962 when he said that, and they still do in 2023, in my view.
Yes, and I think that NATO spreading out beyond Europe and into the Indo-Pacific and others is just showing that global alliance.
Absolutely, no doubt about it, and also it's interesting that you see NATO nations and even NATO in general inviting Japan, Australia, South Korea, New Zealand to alliance summits and helping where possible. And you see Japan, South Korea, and Australia, all three of them playing a pretty significant role in helping efforts in Ukraine. And, the South Koreans are doing a lot to help build up the Polish military and to deter Putin. South Koreans understand well how important it is to be armed and prepared when you have an unhinged neighbor, they're helping the Poles. So both sides of the world, the democracy on both sides helping the other.
Absolutely. Well, Alan, thank you for taking the time to talk to our listeners about these very important issues in your article here.
Always a pleasure. Enjoyed it as always. Thanks, Joy.
Thanks, Alan. And to our listeners, you can read Alan's full article at our website at www.ascf.us. Please subscribe to our newsletter while you're there. And you can find us on Twitter and on Facebook and Instagram under ASCF US. And please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble under American Security Council Foundation. Please join us again next time as we bring you more podcasts on Peace Through Strength.